Hi, I'd like to welcome you to our video series on managing work-related stress, and I will be focusing on the line manager, how they can more effectively deal with this risk in their teams. I would also recommend you check out our other videos on the organisational approach to managing work-related stress and understanding fatigue and burnout. There are 3 parts to this, and this is part 1. Across the 3 videos, we will be looking at adopting a better approach to health, the business case for managing work-related stress, the difference between work-related stress and pressure, an introduction to the management standards, how a line manager can use them for individual risk assessment, and we will share a range of resources that will be of use to you as a line manager. In this first video, we will spend a little time looking at having a better approach to health, and then we will spend most of the time focusing on the business case for managing work-related stress. What I would say from the outset is that this is probably one of the most important parts of the process, because you may know how to assess work-related stress. You might know what the management standards are, but if you don't understand the reason why you should be managing it, and the benefits to you as a line manager, your member of staff, and your organisation, then you won't have the motivation to effectively do it. So let's start by looking at some definitions to help us better understand what is meant by various terms we commonly use. And we're going to look at 4 in particular. These are health, mental health, well-being, and resilience. The World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And I would just say, as we go through these definitions, try and see the commonality that might flow through them. So again, from the World Health Organization, they tell us that mental health is a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stress of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. And you'll see that well-being has been mentioned again. So what do we mean by well-being? Well, the Economic and Social Research Council have defined this as a state of being with others, where human needs are met, where one can act meaningfully to pursue one's goals, and where one enjoys a satisfactory quality of life. Now, before I would go on to resilience, I would point to those 3 definitions, and I hope you noticed there's a holistic approach to the thinking around them. It's not just your physical health. It's not just about you existing as an individual. There's a social aspect of life. It's about being with others, and it's also realistic. It's not expecting life to be a perfect utopia. There will be challenges in life that have the potential to impact you in negative ways, and this, of course, is where resilience can come in. We have a definition from the American Psychological Association that says that it's the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress such as family and relationship problems, serious health problems, or workplace and financial stressors. As much as resilience involves bouncing back from these difficult experiences, it can also involve profound personal growth. So resilience isn't something that you are born with. It's something that you can develop, that you can learn through experience and training. Okay, how do we approach health in a more positive way? And this is something as an individual for you, but also when you're talking to your staff as something that they can be made more aware of. There's a thing called the positive health triangle. And it's really a simple way of thinking of health in that holistic way that we saw in the definitions. So let's use an example. Obviously, your physical health comes to mind. Perhaps you're thinking that I want to get going for a jog. I want to start improving my fitness levels. Maybe just going for a walk as well. Now, that's the physical aspect of it. But when you want to be more holistic and put it in this context of the triangle, what would you say? Well, okay, that's the physical side. But there's also a social side. How can you improve your social health? And so we might join a running club or a walking group, making sure that when we're getting the physical exercise, we're also developing the social aspect of life. And then there's the mental aspect as well. And there's 2 wee bits about that. One is setting yourself attainable goals, right? If you set out to run a marathon on your first run, having not been exercising for a long time, then you're more than likely not going to achieve that aim. And will feel down and despondent about yourself and will be less likely to continue with the activity. So set realistic goals that are achievable. Also, it's important to focus on the moment, to be aware of the world around you and step outside that mental bubble we can get ourselves into to gain perspective. This idea is expanded upon by the Take 5 Steps to Wellbeing initiative, which has been promoted by the Health and Social Care Trust. And it talks about connecting with others, being active, taking notice, continuing to learn, and giving as well. Okay, so let's think about the business case. It's built around three key areas: the financial cost, which is prohibitive, the moral responsibility, which is persuasive, and the legal duty, which is prescribed. And we start off considering the legal duty. The first thing to note is that there is no health and safety legislation at present that specifically mentions work-related stress. So the legal framework is built around two pieces of legislation and best practice guidance. The first bit of legislation is a primary bit of legislation entitled the Health and Safety at Work Northern Ireland Order 1978. And this is the main bit of legislation that all health and safety legislation flows from. If we focus in on Article 4, which talks about the duty of care employers have towards their staff, it places a general duty on employers to take all reasonable precautions to protect the health of their employees. This is then built upon by a subordinate piece of legislation entitled the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations, Northern Ireland 2000. Again, if we focus in on Regulation 3 of that statutory rule, we see it addressing the requirements of employers to carry out risk assessment. In the past, these duties often focused on physical well-being, but it's now recognised that it applies equally to psychological health and well-being. And finally, in order to help employers more effectively risk assess for work-related stress, HSE developed the management standards in 2004 as best practice guidance on carrying out a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. Together, that makes up the legal framework that employers have to operate under regarding work-related stress. Now, to consider the moral responsibility that we have as employers, as line managers, and as colleagues. If we consider this as a moral compass, and we're going to think of 4 points. The first point is that work-related stress can exacerbate pre-existing medical conditions and possibly be a causation factor for other health problems such as heart disease and cancer. So, if someone is suffering from eczema or dermatitis, irritable bowel syndrome, back pain, asthma, and so on and so forth, then work-related stress can make those issues much, much worse. In part 2, we'll be looking at the signs and symptoms, and you will see from them how it's likely to make other conditions worse, but also in the long term, how it can possibly be connected as a causation factor to things like heart disease. The second point is that individuals suffering from work-related stress often adopt maladaptive coping strategies. Just consider for a moment someone suffering from excessive pressure in work. It's not unreasonable to think that they will look for ways to relieve that pressure. So they may go home and start drinking too much or smoking more, perhaps use prescription or even illegal drugs. Maybe excessive gambling is their thing, or spending money they don't have, shopping for things and getting into debt, or a whole range of other means of distracting themselves from the pressure that actually, in and of themselves, is also bad for them. So in effect, it's a double whammy. The third point to make is that there is a responsibility on organisations to contribute to the health of the society they operate in. And ultimately, this is a mutually beneficial act, as a healthier society will make for a healthier and more successful business environment. In fact, for a long time now, successive governments have recognised the connection between poor societal health and wider costs to the country, such as reduced GDP and tax revenue, worklessness, increased crime and poverty, and greater costs to the NHS and welfare. As a result, there is an increasing emphasis on the need for businesses to do their bit in helping to improve societal health. The final point to make is just to note the historical context, which is really to say that this is nothing new. Successful businesses have recognised for a long time that it is better to look after your staff and keep them in work. It keeps them happier, makes them more productive, and is ultimately better for everyone. A quick search online will provide many examples of the organisations who recognised this and did things as far back as the late 1800s to improve the health and well-being of their staff. Things like providing a gym, believe it or not, or time off to study and learn. One company even set up democratically elected works councils, and that was in 1918, with equal numbers of management and worker representatives. So these councils were concerned with working conditions, health, safety, education, training, and the social life of the factory and its workers. It sounds a lot like what we're talking about. So a modern phrase we might use about all this is your corporate and social responsibility. Okay, the financial cost, and we'll start with some statistics. These statistics are taken from both the 2020-21 and the 2019-20 labour force surveys. The first figure to look at is the number of workers suffering from work-related stress, depression or anxiety, and in 2020-21 there were 822,000 employees, and this included 451,000 new cases. Now, this figure was fairly static compared to the previous year, where it was 828,000 employees. In terms of causes of work-related ill health by type, 50% were work-related stress, depression or anxiety. I think that's significant because we put a lot of emphasis on many other issues within work that cause absence, and yet half of the health absences are due to work-related stress. In fact, remembering the moral argument of the business case, work-related stress can cause or make conditions worse. So I would suggest that some of that 28% of musculoskeletal cases and 22% of other types of illness, and actually absences due to accidents as well, may ultimately have been caused by work-related stress. Let's put a bit more detail though on those headline figures. What does that 50% of cases look like in days lost? Well, the recording of workplace statistics has been impacted by wider circumstances in the past year or two, and so we have to look at the 2019-20, which actually is comparable, having had 828,000 working days lost and making up 51% of ill health cases. So it's almost identical. There were 17.9 million working days lost in that year due to work-related stress, depression or anxiety, which was up from the previous year figure of 12.8 million. What does that mean in terms of you though as a line manager? Well, if you have a member of staff who goes off sick as a result of this issue, the average was 21.6 working days lost per case. Just think about that. That's over a month of absence from your team. Now, you may think, say for example, something like musculoskeletal disorders. Although not having as many cases, it's a bigger problem in terms of absence from work. But again, if we look at the stats to complete that picture, 55% of the working days lost due to ill health were as a result of work-related stress, depression or anxiety. Let's think about those costs that can be incurred by a business if this risk is not managed effectively. The first thing I would say is that even if someone doesn't go off sick, there's the problem of presenteeism, which is when a member of staff may be in work but their productivity is reduced. So the member of staff is there, but you're not actually getting the level of productivity from them that you could if they were not suffering from work-related stress. But if they do actually end up going off, well, there are a number of direct costs to your team and the organisation. These direct costs are more easily measured. Things like sick pay, lost production. Maybe you're going to have to sort out overtime to catch up on that lost production. You may have to bring in agency workers. What about rehabilitation and reasonable adjustments? Or there's the potential for fines and possibly even increased insurance premiums. For me, though, the indirect costs are an even bigger problem. It's very hard to calculate the full impact of these on the organisation, and some go unnoticed beneath the surface until it's too late and the damage is done. Things such as staff morale. Poor morale can spread through an organisation like wildfire. People don't feel valued or looked after. Their productivity will fall. So with poor staff morale, it's going to hit their willingness to go the extra mile, and it won't be there. And as always, these things are never isolated but feed into other costs. So again, maybe staff retention will be more difficult. Think of the loss of human capital, all that experience and the training, it's all gone. Then there'll be additional costs to recruit new staff and to train them. Will you be able to get the best people for the job when recruiting? After all, you're likely to suffer a certain amount of reputational damage if you're not looking after your staff and they're all wanting to leave. There are many other costs to consider as well, such as wider societal costs and the damage to industrial relations. I think when you look at that in its totality, this is something you want to manage effectively so it does not impact your organisation, your team, and the work that you have to do as well. So a quick summary of the potential consequences of work-related stress within your team. There will be things like reduced productivity, increased errors, it can hinder creativity and increase poor decision making as well. And we'll see in part 2 with the signs and symptoms why this is actually so likely. There will also be job dissatisfaction, an increased risk of absenteeism and presenteeism as well. And finally, it may contribute to more accidents generally, which also then brings in all the costs associated with that. Just a quick note as we come to the end to highlight the fact that there's obviously other legislation as a line manager you need to be aware of, such as employment legislation, specifically around bullying and harassment, disability discrimination, race relations, sex discrimination, and the Working Time Directive, amongst others. This brings us to the end of part 1 of this 3-part series on your role as a line manager. In part 2, we will be focusing on the difference between work-related stress and pressure, when one becomes the other, and introducing you to the HSE management standards. If you want to contact us for more information or help with anything we've been talking about in this video, then you can contact us via the email stress@hseni.gov.uk or by telephone on 0800 0320 121. Thanks for listening. Take care.